Usually in the old days, I'd go from there up here and jumping up on those stages, but for some reason, I'm not sure what happened. Anyway, as nu she was, I get Gog, I be Zetchishirish. The Oga get the Ogi is a Gihaz, I know. It's a pleasure for me to be here, to see you here, and to thank you for your job that you're doing now. And I got a little bit of not a cold, but every time I go around government offices, I start sneezing and getting a runny nose. I have no idea why. So if I start doing that, that's what's going on. You know, we've come a long ways in Indian country when it comes to museums and comes to libraries and it comes to knowledge of our cultures. But with that said, we have a long ways to go. We still have to infiltrate, if you will, the states and the governments yet, even more so than we're doing now. And every time I go back to where I grew up, and I grew up on the Fort Brother Reservation, and those of you that heard me speak before probably heard this before, but I'm one of the first of my generation to not have the opportunity to see the bottomlands because they were flooded out by the United States government, because they put a dam there and they moved us. And so over the first year of my life, half of my year was spent in a tent in my mama's belly, and then being born in a log house and being raised there. And I can remember many years later when I'm working in the government offices behind my computer, for example, as a superintendent, I would go back there for encouragement. And just like you, maybe when you look at your books or look at your videos or look at your audio recordings or sitting there with the old people, the elders of today, and you start thinking about what they went through. I can remember sitting around my kitchen table in our log house before we got running water, before we got electricity. And my library was sitting with me. My video was sitting with me with names like Yellow Wolf, Black Bear, Crow's Ghost. Some of the old timers that were sitting in that table telling us stories of not how they heard they lived, but how they lived. Some of those old guys, if I could kick myself in the head, I would have, because as a young man, I really didn't realize who I was listening to. I was listening to not only our past, but I was listening to our future. Because as they would instruct me as a young man, not talking to me, but talking among themselves and having me there listen, because I couldn't vocalize anything. I couldn't say anything because I was a young person. I was just a kid. And I couldn't say anything. I had to sit there and listen. And as I told the story before, I love telling this part because maybe some of you went through this and you get kind of fidgety. I know my older brother, who also retired from the National Park Service, named Paige Baker. He was older than me, about 5 years, and of course we're at the kitchen table where all the stories took place over many, many cups of coffee and many, many cigarettes that those old guys would roll out of those old bull durham sacks. I remember that, with talking like this and telling their stories of survival, of challenge, of ceremony, of warriorness, if you will. And I can remember telling them and pursuing by about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. We never had clocks, it seemed like. So by the time we start doing this as kids, or my brother start raising heck with me and getting me to mess around, those old guys would get mad. But they wouldn't get mad like we do today with their kids. Hey, sit down, blah, 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 blah. I remember those old guys would get up. They would have Levi's and good shirts on, but they all carried a knife. And on this side, they would carry a bag. And I can remember those old guys getting up, and if we were raising heck, an old guy looking at me, boy, and when they looked at you, man, if you close your eyes, you still could see them. And I remember them walking towards you, and they say, in our language, they would tell you, you're supposed to be listening. And they would say, oh, those kids that don't listen, you got ears, don't you? They said, you got ears. Then they start going after a knife. If you don't need those ears, they'd say. Start pulling that knife up. Boy, by then, man, you got both ears are like this. And they grab that bag and they say, see, this bag is full of all of our grandkids' ears that don't listen. And they show you that bag, and you could swear in that bag there's ears kind of going like this. But they would start telling you, and you would realize this much later on, not at that time, but you would realize much later on what their story was. And their story was about survival. Their story was about who we are as Indian people. I don't care what tribe we're from, that we're still here. No matter what happened to us in those early days, and it wasn't to us, it was to our grandparents and to our great-great-grandparents. It's been a long time, many, many generations, since we lived the way we wanted to. And the question I always have, no matter where I'm at, is can we do it again? I remember sitting with my father many times, because I grew up on a ranch. I grew up in a ranch, nobody around. Would be riding horseback and would be chasing cows or doing something, and he'd be talking to me, constantly telling me stories. Then we go back to our house. Mom would constantly tell stories as well. And if you really listen to those old timers, some of them were really funny stories. But again, it was about survival. I can remember one day one of the worst stories I've ever heard, and the most sad stories I've ever heard, is when the folks had to leave the bottoms of the big Missouri River because of the dam. Without explanation to the old timers, the government came in and built that dam and chased us out. Sometimes they chased us out with their words. Most of us, they didn't chase out until the water came to our doorsteps. That we couldn't believe they could dam off that mighty Missouri. Matahe, the Mandans called it, the grandfather. And I remember being at our ranch, my dad was so upset with that. He was so mad that we traveled. I wasn't born yet, but they traveled with a team of horses, a wagon, my oldest brother chasing cows, milk cows, and our regular beef cows on his horses, chasing them west, and they were going, our family, to where we were, to where our ranch is at today, which is our you couldn't go any farther because the reservation line was right there. Our back pasture fence was a reservation. Outside of that was Norwegian country. And it was Olsons and Ole Olsen and all those guys that used to yump in their yeeps. I remember that, them saying that. And I can remember my dad had a plan. I didn't realize that till way after, but every spring when it would thaw and the snow would come down, the earth would moisten up and get soft. My dad would have us boys, my brother and I, move that pasture fence about 3 feet. We have one hell of a big ranch now up there. It's kind of Ole Olsen's land, I think, but we still got it going yet. But those stories would follow me throughout my career. And there were many times that it saved me. And one thing I realized that my dad taught me, and the old timers taught me, never take no for an answer. I don't care what happens. There's been times when I've had people in front of me. At Little Bighorn, for example, when I was a superintendent there. One thing I want to do is I want to highlight the American Indians that had a part in that life. And yes, that includes the battle, but also the life. Because if we go to some of our national parks, we go to some of our monuments, we go to some of the historic areas, what they talk about primarily is that event in 1876. Those 2 days in June of 1876, for example. What they don't talk about is how we got there a lot of times. And what they don't talk about is what happened afterwards. And I can remember when I first got to Little Bighorn, we had a lot of problems. And many times I felt, well, okay, what I can do here, I got two choices. I could sit here and be a really good superintendent, sign off on all the papers, kind of bow to DC, or I could make some headway for our tribes. And so I started going to the tribes. And of course, coming in even as a National Park Service superintendent, being one of the first ones maybe they ever saw in uniform, with braids, by the way. By the way, that's another story. When I first came into Park Service, I graduated from Southern Oregon State University in Ashland, Oregon. And again, I didn't want to graduate. Again, thanks to my folks who had a 6th grade education and a sophomore education through the old boarding school systems, encouraged me to get out of there. And I went screaming and fighting, and I did not want to go to school. That's one of the best things they ever did for me. Because when I first got my job with the National Park Service, I worked in a place called Whiskey Town Lake in Northern California. And my first job there, believe it or not, was buying brown heroin. I was law enforcement, and I worked undercover for the National Park Service. Because for one thing, you're not going to see a park ranger with long hair. Or many park rangers you're not going to see looking like me. And so I started that way, and when I got to Theodore Roosevelt, for example, in North Dakota, I was law enforcement. Actually, let me go back a little bit because I love saying this. When I first joined the Park Service, by the way, my first job was cleaning toilets. Then I worked my way down to management from there. So, but I can remember at Theodore Roosevelt. I can remember at Theodore Roosevelt coming in my patrol car. And I would be out patrolling and stopping people. I love to stop people. And I remember going to their evening programs. And there were programs about the environment, obviously. At Theodore Roosevelt National Park, it discussed the ecology of the park. It discussed the Little Missouri River. It discussed the Badlands. It discussed Theodore Roosevelt as a man. It discussed the Marquis de Moore, who was doing a big cattle industry there, and it talked about all these different things. And I would sneak up there. Well, I wouldn't sneak up there. That's kind of in my blood. I would walk up there, and I would watch these white rangers talk about this. And I would always say to myself, man, there's something missing. Well, I knew what it was. It's our story. But as a young kid, I remember I used to be so scared that I stuttered really bad up until my boarding school years, because I was scared to talk in front of people. And so I got the courage one time to go to the chief naturalist, chief ranger, for interpretation. And I asked her if I could do a program about us. That was our territory. That was the Awadicha territory. I'm a Mandan Hiradza, but we come from represent 5 different sub-tribes, if you will, of the Mandan Hiradza. The Hiradza being the Awadicha, Awaka'awi, Hiradza, the Mandans being the Nupta and the Nuptari. Each one having their own dialect, each one having their own uniqueness, but all the same as well. And I figured, well, I'm going to do this. And at that time, I used to try to dance. I tried to do my hand at fancy dancing back in those days. And so I figured, I can do this. There'll be nothing there but white people. And I'll put my outfit on, and I'll kind of hide behind my feathers, and I can really go for it. Talk a little bit. And I knew my folks wouldn't come, my relatives wouldn't come, even though they were like 28 miles away. It was a reservation, because many of us had cars or not really care about national parks back in those days. And so I think I mentioned it to my mother or something. I was going to be doing this on a Saturday night, whatever. And I remember the evening before, it was a time when national parks could actually have fires. You don't have fires anymore, and as far as campfire programs anymore. We had a campfire program, so I got that going. I put part of Hiradza songs on a loudspeaker. Well, I went back, had a little building. I got my stuff on. And my plan was to get that one song really going good, and I'd come dancing around. Dancing around the side. I was just going to impress all those white people. I started, I came around the corner like that, and the first 2 rows were all relatives. I think I missed about 6 beats that time. That was one of the toughest programs I ever gave. Because again, you look at those old guys, man, there's no expression. No matter what you say. But even then, that was a lesson. And the lesson for me was, we can't give up. No matter how things go sometimes, you can't give up. And no matter what we want to do, stay within the comfort of ourselves, within the comfort of our cultures, within the comfort of our even academic cultures. I'm here to tell you that's not enough. We have to be prepared on a daily basis to step out of that box. Sometimes we have to go against the flow to get things done. And sometimes it's going to take every bit of our will, every bit of our spirit, every bit of our physical being. But you're never alone. That's when our people come with us. That's when my friend here that said, even empty chairs are filled. Absolute truth. Many, many times when I'd be in the face of something or when somebody's in the face of my face, I'd have to call upon my grandparents to help me, to give me the patience, to give me the courage, to give me the intelligence to do this properly. And if it's to give me the courage to step on toes, then I will. If it's the best thing we can do, not for us, for our people. What we're doing today, and what you're doing today, absolutely commendable. But we got to do more. Like I said before, we still have to infiltrate the state and the government. We have a long ways to go if you look at the hierarchy, no matter what we do in the government agencies. The hierarchy in the government agencies do not represent us. And that's where we have to step out of this box and get into those positions. Somehow. We're in a world of hurt right now. Not Indian country. I'm talking America. And the thing that we have to go back to, as I say to people all the time, especially young ones, what we're missing in our lives, make decisions, I believe, is prayer. No matter what ceremonies you do, keep doing them. If it's sweats, if it's fasting, if it's public ceremonies. But we got to get our young involved. Our young right now is involved in social media all the time. Maybe we are too. I feel myself so fortunate because my wife and I live in a place where I don't get cell service. My cell phone call is a coyote coming up about 10 feet away and yelling at me. Of course, I yell back, but anyway, no, I don't shoot them. But we're in real big trouble right now, what I can see with our young people. The schools, even they're doing their darndest to help out, but that's not their responsibility, ladies and gentlemen. That's our responsibility. As parents, as grandparents, as clan uncles, as clan fathers, as clan mothers, as on and on and on. So wherever your journey is taking you, grab a young one and take them with you. Grab several young ones and take them with you. When you do interviews, for example, if we still have a lot of elders left that have those stories, but the elders are leaving. That's what's so scary. Everybody I knew as a kid that told me stories, I could listen for hours. In fact, I'm supposed to be fixing fence, but I can sit on my truck and listen to those stories once again. We're losing that. Some of those are on paper, but on paper, you don't have the emotion. On paper, you don't have the same expressions. On paper, you don't have the same feelings when you read it. And so we're getting away from some of that. But we still have elders in every one of our communities that we should be taping, that we should be listening to, that should be paying attention to, that we should be helping out on their journey. And I go back again to many, many times in the Park Service when I felt like this is it. I'm done. I can't take it anymore. Next guy that comes up to me and says, I'd like to, if I was young back in those days, and I had a guy do this, an attorney do this to me at Little Bighorn. When I opened up and I brought the American Indians in first before George Custer and his 7th Cav. Before I got there, they were having the celebration, if you will, of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And they would put George Custer first, always, and the first day. And when I got there, I got to thinking about that, and I was thinking, man, didn't he lose? And so I got a hold of my relatives back home, the Arikaras, the Cheyennes, the Ogalalas, the Lakotas, the other groups that were involved. I got them, and we started having conversations about this. And I put them first. I had a 4-day program. I will never call it a celebration. A 4-day program, and I put Custer and his boys last. And at one point in time, I remember sitting there, and I had a little guy come up to me, madder than a hot firecracker. And I was in my uniform. And at that time, I was still commissioned, which means I still had my weapons on me. This guy came up to me and he said, you know, if we lived back in those days, I'd be the first to take your babies, throw them in the air, and catch them with my bayonet. And the guy was serious. How do you educate something like that? I had my way, but I'd be in prison right now. But the best way to educate, as the old man used to always say, you kill him with the goodness. You kill him with the goodness. And so you start talking. And when I started talking, he wasn't in the mood to hear. So he left. That's his right. And I remember at that time having to go back, walk by myself on the Little Bighorn battlefield, and talk to those ones that died on both sides, by the way, and ask them to help me. Asking my dad to help me since my dad was then gone. What do I do now? Pray hard enough, ask hard enough. It seems like the answers come somehow. And the answer was to keep doing what I'm doing, to keep educating, to get the young involved, to understand that battle. Not just from those 2 days of 1876, but those 200 years before that battle took place. And trying to humanize every one of those people that died on that battlefield on both sides. And I go up to the place of Lewis and Clark. I had the opportunity and privilege of running the bicentennial of this country from Lewis and Clark. And I can remember coming here, D.C., and I can remember going to I think it was the White House. We had a first meeting because the First Lady was the honorary chair. And I can remember standing, everybody was all excited saying, oh man, we're going to celebrate Lewis and Clark. We're going to celebrate this. And we want to introduce you to the first superintendent of Lewis and Clark Trail, Gerard Baker. And there I was smiling, clapping. And I got up and I said, the first thing we're not going to do is celebrate. We're not going to celebrate. You could hear a pin drop in that damn room. I could almost see in their minds, oh God, we hired the wrong guy. I said, what we're going to do is we're going to commemorate an event that took place on our land. And I asked them this, and no matter what you do is something to ask yourselves in a different perspective, obviously. But I asked them this, we're so enthralled and so enthralled of being all together on Lewis and Clark's boat again, going up the river, exploring new places, new peoples. And I asked them, I said, get off those boats. Don't be on the boat with Lewis and Clark, but be in the villages when those boats come around the corner. See what impact it had. See what impact it still has. See what they did, what they left, and what the future what the future's still going to do. So we had a new perspective, I believe, on that. But every time we do something now in your offices or whatever your projects are, think about that. Think of something that you really don't, God, I shouldn't get into that politically. I'm here to tell you, get into it politically. Get into it. You're helping the future out. You're helping all those young people out that are coming up. Take them with you on this journey that you got going. I don't care if it's language, if it's old books. I love old books. I'm proud of my library. I also ask you, I'm getting out of time here, I'm asking you to do one other thing when you're doing this. And I say this to every group I talk to. And I think you'll understand, and I'm sure you do it now, I hope. No matter how fast you're going, no matter where you're at, on the reservation, a reservation town, a city, a government office, stop once in a while and take a breath and look up. Smell. Take a walk. Look at the spirits that are there. Feel the spirits that are there. Acknowledge the spirits that are there. But take a break from that and go back to where we came from, which is this earth. Go back to where we came from, which is our ancestors. Ask them a question. And maybe you'll be surprised what the answer is. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Aho.
Walter Echo Hawk and I have this wonderful privilege of presenting a Pendleton blanket.